Okay, let's begin. Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina from UC San Diego. It's November 21st, 2023 at 4 p.m. in lovely San Diego, which means it's midnight in London, where our speaker today joins us from. And it is November 22nd, 2023 in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu. Okay, let's begin. Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina from UC San Diego. It's November 21st, 2023 at 4 p.m. in lovely San Diego, which means it's midnight in London, where our speaker today joins us from. And it is November 22nd, 2023 in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu. Oops. Oh, here we go. Yes, I'm Ulrike Schaede, professor and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology here at the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. This event finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have a lot of information on this slide, possibly the most important of which is that we offer various degrees programs, including a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in more of our activities, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is the Japan Center at GPS. We are trying San Diego with Japan and illuminate Japan's role in world commerce, innovation, politics, and societal issues. Our events are recorded, as many of you regulars know. What that means is that what we're going to ask you to do is type your questions into the Q&A box. And if I read out your question, I will refer to you only by first name. But that's maybe the bad side. The good news is that we have a library called the JZ Gallery, and you can find links to past events at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. Before I introduce Mariko Togashi, our speaker today, let me just tell you that we have upcoming events planned. On December 5th, we have Jasmine Abel, who's a professor at Penn State, talk about her recent book, Dream Super Express, which is a cultural history of the Tokaido Shinkansen that was built in 1964. And I thought that was a great topic to end the year on and get you all ready for the holidays. And then we'll come back in 2024 with Robbie Feldman and Kenji Kushida, my good friends and colleagues, to discuss entrepreneurs in Japan. And we'll actually have a lot of events on entrepreneurship in the winter quarter coming. So please stay. Please make sure you have your spam filter off, and so that our emails and social media advertising reaches you. All right, so let me stop and introduce our speaker today. So stop share, and here she is, Mariko Togashi. Hello to London.
Hello, Ulrike Sensei. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you, and I really appreciate that you're staying up. But we met at a conference in Belgium in the summer, and we had such a great conversation. I thought we must absolutely do this as a Japan Zoominar. So let me introduce you. So Mariko Togashi is a research fellow for Japanese security and defense policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, as you can see in her background, which is in London. Prior to joining IISS, Mariko was the Matsumoto Samata Fellow at the Asia Pacific Initiative, which today I think is known as part of the activities of the International House of Japan, which many of us Japan academics, of course, hold very dear to our hearts. And prior to the Asia Pacific Initiative Fellowship, Mariko worked for 5 years on not Wall Street, in Otemachi, as an equity analyst in Tokyo, with Deutsche Bank and also BofA Merrill Lynch, which is now known as BofA Securities. And she was an analyst in the Japanese tech sector. And that makes her one of the most interesting people, I think, to talk about global supply chains and who plays what role in technology and so forth. Prior to doing all this, Mariko earned a BA in law from Keio University and an MA in strategic studies and international economics from Johns Hopkins SAIS, our prime competitor in the education. But we don't hold it against you, though. So thank you, Mariko, for joining us. It's really great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. So let me share my screen first. Awesome. Well, again, thank you very much for having me today. I'm very honored and excited to be here. So today I'd like to, of course, the title's here, Japan's economic security and role in global supply chains. I'd like to talk about 3 points before we get into our discussion. First, I will give an overview of Japan's economic security policy developments. And second, I will also cover Japan's new industrial policy. And finally, I will touch on Japan's role in global supply chain restructuring. So to respond to the strategic challenges in the region, mainly driven by China's more assertive actions, Japan has bolstered its effort in economic security policymaking in the past few years. As you can see, Tokyo added the economic division to the National Security Secretariat in 2020. The Kishida administration created the first ever economic security minister position in 2021. And last year, in May, Tokyo passed the Economic Security Promotion Act. This complemented Japan's economic security policy that the existing laws, such as the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act, could not cover. And of course, last December, Japan launched the revised national security strategy, which not just officially defined the term for the first time and laid out the concrete agenda, but elevated this economic security concept to a national security level. And most recently, last month, METI published the Economic Security Action Plan, which introduced their concrete policies in 3 categories, which are promote, protect, and partnership. And on top of the institutional changes and passing the domestic law, Japan is also leading the international cooperation in economic security. Of course, I'm not going to get into the details because of the time constraint, but there's, of course, G7, Quad, IPF has an important platform, Camp David Summit, which is US, Japan, ROK, trilateral cooperation, and also on the bilateral front, we could discuss this later, but of course, there's US, Japan, EU, Japan, UK, Germany, etc. So now I went through very briefly the economic security policy developments. I'd like to touch on Japan's new industrial policy as well, as it does relate a lot to the economic security policy. I'd like to say these two are not the same. But economic security policy has a significant influence on industrial policy, as industrial capability is the key to achieving autonomy and indispensability, which are the key concepts of economic security. And at the same time, economic security is one of the factors that is driving the shift in Japan's industrial policy, which I will touch in a minute. A very quick overview of Japan's industrial policy in the past, for those who are not necessarily familiar with the topic. After the post-war industrialization, focusing on the heavy industries, Japan's industrial policy took a step back since around the 1970s with structural reforms and deregulation, especially in the 1980s, as Japan's technological capability was enhanced significantly, as well as changing trade balance and exchange rate. And the government's intervention restarted as a crisis response to the global financial crisis and the Great East Japan earthquake from around the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s. And more recently, economic security policy and other social needs are driving the large investments in specific sectors, gaining broad support for intervention among policymakers. So this chart on this slide is what METI has put on its material called New Direction of Economic and Industrial Policy, where it compares the old and new industrial policies. So while the old industrial policy uses mid-sized stimulus to protect and grow specific industries, the new industrial policy uses large-sized stimulus to solve diverse social and economic issues. The former industrial policy fixes the failure of the market, while the current policy creates new markets as an entrepreneurial state. And another difference, which is it's not written here, but is the flexibility of the programs. While there were many past industrial policies that failed due to the inflexibility, Economic Security Promotion Act, for example, tries to ensure flexibility by design. And a few observations of the impact of economic security policy on industrial policy. So first, economic security policy is reinvigorating Japan's industrial policy by bringing in national security interests into industrial policy, which gives different rationale for large spending. And the second observation is that economic security policy is one of the biggest drivers for Japan to form a new type of industrial policy that I just explained. The targeting is becoming more specific under economic security policy, which you probably will recall vertical industrial policy in the past, but there's a difference that I just touched on. And the third observation is that, excuse me, economic security policy is also changing the way how industrial policy supports the industry, from specific technologies to the whole supply chain. This is because industrial policy, from the economic security perspective, focuses on resiliency based on threat perception and relative strength and weaknesses compared to the other countries. For instance, in the semiconductor industry, the government is supporting from the domestic production base to supply chains, materials, production equipment, and the next generation R&D through subsidies, consortium, and also state-backed funds. So, given the Japan's economic security policy making and the new approach and high motivation towards industrial policy, what's Japan's role in the supply chain restructuring? Japan has so far used subsidies and Economic Security Promotion Act, but where is Japan heading, and what is its role? I think that before getting into the three roles that I wanted to mention, I think the ultimate question when we think about any country's role in this supply chain restructuring is that where do we stand in the spectrum between market efficiency and security? And of course, it's not that simple. And there are hundreds of questions, such as how do you assess the threat? How much are you exposed to certain countries? Is that exposure replaceable, whether that is the supply or the demand? Which are the exact things that countries are working on. But I think there's three key roles that Japan can play. I think one of the biggest roles for Japan to play is to build the stable and constructive relationship, mutually beneficial relationship, in the word that was used in APEC, with China, and make sure the world does not fall into protectionism or an unnecessarily or overly inefficient supply chains. We're certainly shifting away from efficiency maximization, from just in time to just in case. And this will be the direction as the line between economy and security blurs. But this shift to find the new optimal point has to be done carefully in order to achieve both security and economic efficiency. And this is a very delicate but very important task, which requires a lot of knowledge of China from the top government level to business level and people to people level. And I think Japan has the ability to do this. And of course, I'm not saying that we should do business as before. There are many things that should be addressed and changed, including IP theft, mandatory technology transfer, etc. But we can't fall into tit for tat or an unhealthy competition that drags each other down. Another role that Japan can play is to adjust the interests among the like-minded countries. Clearly, as much as countries agree on the direction and the core values, there are notable differences as well. For instance, the biggest difference right now is probably our stance on free trade. I think Japan should keep the ball rolling in expanding the free trade zone and keep the global South countries with us in a way that Japan can. And of course, IPEF is also a key initiative, but that definitely does not mean Japan cannot pursue other policy goals, especially given the political uncertainty of the U.S. Another example of the divergence was I would say October 7th, not this year, last year, export controls. Japan and the Netherlands followed the U.S. Export control against China on advanced semiconductor, but not necessarily to the same extent. And I think there's room for Japan to adjust the different interests to deepen international economic security cooperation. And finally, this is more on the domestic side, but the role for the Japan's role to play is to align the government's and companies' interests. Of course, this is easier said than done, but to increase the dialogue for policymaking beyond the carrot and stick approach is the key. At the end of the day, the majority of the decisions when it comes to supply chain restructuring comes from business decision rather than subsidies. Of course, subsidies can give momentum and can have some power, but logically speaking, it cannot possibly cover everything sustainably. Therefore, communicate more, share intelligence with key companies, and form policy together is what I think is critical. And since Japan is already advanced in its economic security policy making, if Japan can do this, I think it helps other countries reconcile these two potentially competing interests. So I'll stop there.
Well, that's terrific. Wow. I have to wrap my head around this very compact and very insightful kickoff speech. Thank you. So I have a few questions, and then the audience will eventually chime in and write their questions in the Q&A. But those of you who know my interests in this, since I'm a business scholar, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the business aspects of this before we go back to the policy. And that is how important, I mean, if you were to map some of the global supply chains, it could be semiconductors or it could be batteries or something, whatever you'd like. Let's do semiconductors. Why not? Where does Japan sit at the technology frontier? I mean, is it so my story, of course, is that the world cannot make a semiconductor without some Japanese inputs, which I see as a power position that actually fuels some of the activities that you just described in terms of peacemaking and balance creation and so forth. So can you talk a little bit more about Japan's technology position in the larger world rankings?
Sure. I think it's a very difficult question. And then, of course, it depends on the industry. But I think Japan is still competitive. And of course, there are certain areas that Japan declined significantly, which is probably discussed a lot, like semiconductor production or home appliances. And also, I understand that Japan is lagging behind in many emerging technologies. But as you also discussed in the book, like it as aggregate niche, Japan is still competitive in certain technologies. Chemicals, of course, as you pointed out, and also, for example, in semiconductor industry, semiconductor material, of course, and semiconductor production equipment, high-level machine tools too. Of course, in certain clean energy technologies as well. There are a lot of technologies that Japan possess, which is called choke point. So, as in your word that you mentioned, the world cannot you cannot make certain product without Japan. So, yes, we can't be overly optimistic, but I don't think we have to be overly pessimistic.
So, I've been trying to figure this out, and you may have insights on this. My impression is that there are a few countries in the world that could, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, push comes to shove, and we're going into complete decoupling. We'll talk later how we want to make sure that doesn't happen. But let's just hypothetically, go there. And in such a case, my sense is that Japan could fairly easily recreate a domestic semiconductor industry with all the steps of the supply chain, except maybe the initial rare earth materials. And maybe the only other country that could do that, I'm not sure, but so it's a question, might be Germany. But or the Netherlands, Germany with the Netherlands or something like that. But what do you think about that? Is that true?
Japan can create semiconductors. I mean, that's what it's not easily. If I can disagree, I would agree to the easily part. But that's basically what Japan's trying to do, right? As of now, we have the 40 nanometers production capability, but we're trying to fill in the gap between that and the latest 2 nano. Recently 1 nano was on the news as well, but we're trying to fill in the gap with the TSMC factory in Kumamoto. So, of course, we are reliant on, for example, US semiconductor design capability, but as given the context of the question of when it comes to decoupling, I assume you would be with the US side. So putting that aside, Japan will be able to answer to your question, be able to recreate semiconductors.
So that's a great example, right? Because it might also be true in batteries, I'm not sure, but what does that mean for economic security policy? I mean, that's because China, and I understand also South Korea, cannot do everything domestically quite yet, at least, right?
Korea does, but I think for what it means to Japan in terms of economic security, I think it means we cannot lose this. And by this, I don't want to sound to use this as a economic coercion. It's actually to deter, not to use as a leverage, but not to use that as a leverage, but more to use it as a deterrence to economic against economic coercion. So to keep those tools and then not to lose them, which requires a lot of investment to keep the competitiveness, is necessary. Because like I touched in the presentation as well, it is economic security is also about relativity and what it means, but how indispensable you can be to other countries.
Right. That's the thing, right? So who has power in all of this, or who can, and not even coercion, right? So who's needed? Who are like the central club members? And we mentioned the Netherlands already. They're kind of important in here. The United States, of course, because the cutting edge innovation on chip design still here, right? And some of the materials are in Japan, and so there's a club there. And if they can get their act together, then maybe we can keep this stable. Let me go to the industrial policy aspects of this, because I think that's really interesting. Right? So if you think about, if there's a core competence in Japanese policymaking over the last 80 years, it would have to be industrial policy, right? And now this comes back with this, just at a time when we were thinking, well, should we abolish METI, or what do we do with it? Here comes industrial policy back. And the United States started this in a way with its CHIPS Act. And the United States has no core competence at all whatsoever in industrial policy making. And yet the world is following sort of the US. Are the METI people just going, whoa, look what we found. This is great. We're once again strong? Or what do you think is the thinking? And what is this new industrial policy? And you mentioned it briefly, but can you talk a little bit more about what that means in reality?
Sure. Starting with the thinking part, I'm sure there is this momentum and excitement, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but what, as a analyst, something that I should be, cautious when observing policies. So yes, I think there's definitely momentum and excitement at METI. I know certain people who were not able to implement this kind of policy for a long time, and they do feel, it's coming back. So I think that is there for sure. But is it the same? Like I said, it's not the same. And I think one, of course, I already, touched on the differences between the old um, industrial policy. Excuse me. Sorry, I just caught a cold. Excuse me.
Well, it's midnight in London too,
Yeah,
so you are definitely excused.
But what I wanted to, excuse me, point out was that one emphasis that came with the new industrial policy is the EBPM, evidence-based policymaking. And but if you look at the Sangyo Kozo Shingika's material, there's a lot of material on EBPM as well. So it comes with I'm sure, as well as the excitement is there is this sense of responsibility of making the EBPM, for example, more real time, to make these policy not irresponsible. So yes, to answer to your questions directly, yes, there is momentum, but it's certainly different from the past industrial policy.
I thought it was very interesting that he points out that the old industrial policy of the roaring, go-go years of the 60s and 70s, that was all about carrot and sticks. That the government had a bunch of laws, and then it had a bunch of licenses and stuff that it could give. You do this, or or then that. And today it's a completely different thing, right? So there are the Gaitameho, the foreign exchange and foreign trade law, is coming back. Also, it has a roaring re-entry, right? It used to be a main tool for METI to say, no, you can't import this, or you can't export this, and it's coming back. There have been several revisions over the last couple of years. So I think the carrot and sticks I may want to differ a little bit with you there, if I may. That the carrot and sticks are actually coming back too, and I'm wondering whether that's worrisome. That on the spectrum that you mentioned of do we believe in markets and the mechanisms of the market, or do we believe in the benevolent government that can drive business decisions? Is there a concern that we're going backwards, maybe in the United States as well, perhaps?
When you ask, is the carrot and stick approach coming back? I think yes, like you just said, Gaitameho has got stricter. And then, like you said, the revision has happened several times. So yes, that too. And if you look at Economic Security Promotion Act, that's exactly about carrot and stick type of approach. But then at the same time, that's not everything, and that's the exact point that I mentioned, and I think that's what Japan has to do more. But I think the mindset of, okay, we do have to align the interest of the government and companies is definitely there. The interaction between business and the government is increasing, but from the business side, I think a bit more clarity is needed. But yes, the carrot and stick approach is coming back, but I personally don't see it as too worrisome, because the different type of approach is also coming with it.
Well, I mean, the biggest difference, obviously, is that in the go-go years of the 1960s and so forth, the goal was very clear: to catch up with the West, right? And so import the technologies, make consumer gadgets around them, and export them back, right? And so the goal was very clear, and the technology frontier was well defined. The United States and some European countries were on it, and so we need to get there. And today, it's not clear to me that the government necessarily knows what the technology frontier of tomorrow is going to look like, and what kind of technologies are needed. And so it's got to be a completely different approach to designing these policies, right? We're getting questions in. So, for instance, David wonders whether Japan is getting better, whatever that means in your view, at forming and implementing industrial policy quicker and more, sort of more applicable to changing global circumstances. How would that look like?
I mean, I'm not in a position to judge. I mean, just because, also it just started too. I think it's too early, but I think looking at the policies up until now, I think it has good, good evidence that it can be better forming industrial policy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we'll have to watch. So that's fair. So the elephant in the room is, of course, China. We're getting a lot of questions on that. So let me pass some of them on to you. So Chris is wondering regarding China, what are the practical steps the government can take to reset the relationship? Right, so something isn't quite right, and so and the concern there isn't tit for tat inevitable, and any actions that Japan take will drive a Chinese response. So you mentioned in your intro remarks that that's an important part, that a role that Japan can play. Can you say a little bit more about what that might look like?
Of course, continuing the dialogue on all levels. And yes, we're talking about economic security, but today, but just generally to continue the conversation on all levels is critical, which unfortunately haven't necessarily the case with Japan, but also more so with the US. So I think, first of all, that high level continuing the conversation is by far the most important. And we already saw that in APEC. And then most recently we did see that at APEC. And we both understand, as in China and Japan, both understand that this mutually beneficial relationship is critical for both countries. So that's, of course, number one. But then I think Japan is already, of course, there's a lot more that Japan can do, I believe, but is doing already, I would say, adjusting or being in the middle of, like for example, if you look at the October 7th export controls of advanced semiconductors done by the US, Japan followed the US for good reason, but then at the same time, it's not doing it to the same extent. And similar things happened in the past as well. If you recall the supply chain subsidies way before Economic Security Promotion Act, Japan did put subsidies in place, but the amount itself wasn't too big to obviously to move the whole supply chain or anything. So Japan, I think this is not about just this issue, but Japan has been dealing with this US tie and the relationship with China. So I think Japan is actually, if you look closely, doing already well. But I think this has to keep on going.
So yeah, so we have another question along those lines. Sungyun wonders exactly this, right? So almost like a straddle where one of the most significant challenges facing Japan's supply chain restructuring is the disparity between in the stances toward China between Tokyo and Washington. Right? So Washington, the United States, pretty resolute right now. There were some conversations last week in San Francisco, but yeah, pretty resolute. And pandas were exchanged, but that's far from what we're talking about. And so Japan's more flexible. So how can Japan manage to maintain a stable relationship with China while simultaneously safeguarding its alliance with the United States? Can this be stable? Can this be balanced? It's a balancing act, right? In a way.
Yes, absolutely. It's a balancing act. But one solution, I think, is it will take a long time, but it's just go one by one. For example, in terms of industry. So not do a blanket ban or just, I'm not saying Japan is doing that, but just follow the US blindly, but then assess what that means for Japanese industry and assess how, for example, to which level you want to protect that specific product line. Or in other words, it's how you define this high fence, small yard, right? Like we've been talking about that for a long time, but to define that one by one in its own terms, I think is the way to balance that.
So that great second to the next question that just popped up. Michael wonders, what are important areas of difference between how the US and Japan perceive and communicate economic security vis-a-vis China? And I think that a whole PhD thesis could be written about this. But if you, from where you sit, if you can think of a few examples, maybe, so important areas where the US thinks economic security is really important and Japan thinks, nah, the market is big and we want to go, and so it's not that important, or vice versa.
I mean, the convergence for itself, convergence will be the biggest one will be, I would say, semiconductors. But then I think the question was about divergence.
Right. So are there areas where where the US and Japan are very different?
I think even with so I did say yes, convergence with the semiconductors, but again, if you look at what Japan is exactly doing in terms of putting regulations in place, there are certain differences, even in that semiconductor field. If you look at the October 7th regulation, how Japan followed, and another biggest difference is that I touched on it, but it's the stance towards free trade. If you're in America, and I'm sure you follow way more than I do, but that divergence is the biggest, in my opinion, even now, but more so moving forward.
So Rick has a question it goes directionally into this idea of value sharing, where U.S. trade policy is no longer go alone and the U.S. determines what's going on, but there are alliances with countries that share our values, and so it's not going alone. There are these alliances, and so that's actually a very complicated matter as well, right? So Rick's question is whether economic security means the self-sufficiency of any country, like Japan, right? So we talked about the semiconductors. Is Japan self-sufficient? Or is it the self-sufficiency of a whole community of friends and allies to which Japan belongs, right? And the challenge with this is that in the United States right now, we have things like Buy America elements that's popping back up, and there are politicians that think that's what it's all about, or America should go it alone, and so forth and so on. So can you talk a little bit about whether economic security is sort of a common good, or how these multilateral agreements might pan out?
Right. I think Japan's view, and also my view, is that economic security should not be only about self-sufficiency. And of course, there are certain products or certain technologies that should be self-sufficient. I'm not saying that's the wrong call, but economic security should not primarily be about only self-sufficiency, because at the end of the day, security and economic benefit, which are both economic growth, which are both national interests, and we are talking about where these two can compete. So I don't think when we talk about economic security, that is, we're talking about self-sufficiency. Like, for example, bringing back the topic to the supply chain, the IMF did the study of global fragmentation, and the global fragmentation of FDI will be negative 2% of our total output in the long run. And this doesn't even include trade or other, or tech decoupling, if I recall correctly. And this is just, one calculation, but it's significant. So we have to keep in mind. So, going back to your, sorry, it was a bit of a tangent, but going back to your question, I have a, strong opinion that economic security has to be the discussion of balancing these two and minimizing the risk, but not about being, about protectionism or self-sufficiency. If that makes sense.
So our audience still wants us to talk a little bit about Japan's self-interest here. So a couple of questions around that. And one is one that I'm also very interested in, which is we talked about semiconductors a lot. Is semiconductors a special case, or can we derive? Is it okay to derive a somewhat general truth that Japan is a leader in materials, for instance, and that this truth also holds for cell phones and and other things? Or is the semiconductor story really special? That's one. And then following up on that, Sean has a fabulous question, wondering if there is a made in Japan industrial policy movement, which it seems to be, what industries should that aim for in the future? What should Japan make in Japan to have this? And again, I don't want to call it coercive power, but this the ability to balance and uphold sort of the global supply chains as they are.
Okay, those are great questions. So is semiconductor special? I think you can still, drag certain lessons and certain certain lessons to other, you can apply to other industries. But I still think semiconductors are special because, one, the supply chain is very unique in a way that, so there are only limited number of players of each production of each supply chain. So starting from materials, there are only limited players. Semiconductor, the design, the Americans are dominant. Semiconductor production equipment, Japan, Netherlands. So for each, and you can actually divide that into more pieces, even in the production equipment. It depends on where exactly we're talking about, and in that specific what stage of the production or in the supply chain, it is very highly dominant. Certain countries are highly dominant. So in that sense, and also that supply chain characteristics, and also the amount you need. The money you need to invest for new fab. That's a different level of money that we're talking about. So in that two sense, I think semiconductors are. And also, sorry, if I may add, the importance of the final product, and of course there's ups and downs. It's a cyclical sector, but the need for the product is promising, at least for the foreseeable future. So for those three reasons, I think again some lessons are drawable, but it is certainly special. So that's why I think it's even more important to study this case. Please take it with a grain of salt, because I used to analyze this sector, but I believe so. And about the made in Japan question, of course, from economic security perspective, products that you need for example, semiconductors, of course, because Japan needs it for its automotive production. So, and also, for example, personal protection equipment that's critical for people's health. Those sectors, sure, but I'm in general not necessarily for made in Japan idea, and I think that's exactly what's happening in Japan's industrial policy too. If you look at, I didn't mention it in the previous discussion, but it used to be made it the obsession with made in Japan. But now, if you look at it, we're partnering with Japan has obviously TSMC factory in Kumamoto, and partnering with IBM, IMEC. So that aspect is the biggest big difference from the past and current industrial policy. So I don't think made in Japan should be the case, to be honest, unless it's the necessity items.
Yeah. So and of course Japan over the last 40 years or so has very proactively invested in FDI and is operating a global production network. So I'm not sure that made in Japan is, but the semiconductors are being pulled in. And so that's an interesting case study. Hiroki wonders how this entire sudden shift, and so we're talking 3-4 years with this whole economic security and the minister in charge of economic security, and how does that affect Japan's economic growth? I mean, it's very expensive, right? So, but do you think that, I know you're not a trained economist, and we're not doing, but in what you're reading and what the government thinks, is this at the end of the day going to is one of the goals with all of this to increase Japanese economic growth, or is that just something that we're going to talk about later some other time?
I mean, it says so, right? The government says, for example, in the national security strategy, the creation of this positive cycle was mentioned. And if you look at the new capitalism, that's the theme. But I think we do have to assess that thoroughly. And like I mentioned, market intervention, again, I'm not a trained economist, but in theory, market intervention is counterproductive. That's there. And IMF has the thorough research of global fragmentation. That's there. So at least in the short run, it is not something that will boost growth, is for sure. But in the long run, if we think about the scenario that that we did not put these regulations or whatever is in place right now, and compare the worst case scenario, I believe it's the growth with these measurements is probably higher. But like I said, hence the balance is critical, right? Because if you go too far, it can damage the growth, and that's not recoverable in just 1 year or two. That can haunt a few decades. So,
right, as it might the United States, which is throwing a bunch of money at, whether that's a CHIPS Act or all of these other things. It's not clear whether that's going to be healthy or not. But so we'll just have to see. But it's very interesting. So, but we're getting more questions on semiconductors since we opened this up, and you clearly are a specialist on this. So, so Anne is inviting us to talk a little bit more in detail. That she mentioned that not all semiconductors are the same, right? And so the majority are not 5G cutting edge, and the majority are actually not nationally security sensitive or even difficult to manufacture, right? So if when we talk about these supply chain dependencies, are we talking only about these like super difficult ones, or is it really the entire industry, and does that make sense, right? So why don't we have like the very simple ones just flow transnationally without barriers and focus on the complicated ones, or is that the wrong way to look at this?
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's what the U.S. is saying too, right? That we're not going to regulate what is called commodity semiconductors. So yes, you're absolutely right that they're not the same, and the logic behind all these regulations is that we are, trying to stop the cutting edge semiconductors that can go into defense sector or other strategic sectors. So yes, they're not the same. And
well, that's interesting though, right? Because if that's true, then Hiroki's economic question weighs in even more heavily, right? We're spending a ton of money for a small part of an industry that until 3-4 years ago was not seen as problematic at all. So are we putting ourselves in a bind? And if it's really only a small section of this, then the economic negative impact could be pretty high, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, so for example, like we discussed Kumamoto TSMC Kumamoto factory. I mean, there are actually today there's the news of the third line production line. But initially it was what 2028 to 22, which is, you know, for the not necessarily the cutting edge commodity zone. So yes, you're absolutely right that, I mean, it is necessary for Japan's production-based perspective, but it is in a way kind of locking in the high cost structure, if you think about it, compared to having the fab in different countries or like lower cost countries. So that aspect is absolutely true. But the question is that we, you know, weigh which is important to secure those products or take higher costs. And I think the government's answer so far was to, you know, protect the supply. And I think another thing that's worth mentioning was that this all happened after the pandemic, and that for, you know, obviously made the vulnerabilities very visible, and semiconductors especially was hit. So that was also, you know, people's memories are very fresh. So that impacted too.
So the regulars know that I towards the end I like to ask this question, this doomsday question, but then I want to do this early enough so that we can actually end on a positive note. So as you look at in particular the semiconductors, but economic security, you know, more generally, what worries you most? I mean, what is sort of the thing that we should all think about should absolutely never happen?
I think it is the direction, if the countries go too far towards the direction of protectionism. I think we've discussed this a lot, but like I said, we are in a way trading off the two very important national security by taking these measures. And you know, if we go too far, and if we, for example, lock in too high cost structure, I mean, this is not saying we are, but if we do, that means, you know, sales at the end of the day, that is the initial money for the for investment. So if we make that block too small, and if we lose the competitiveness of whatever product that we're talking about, everybody can lose. And I think, you know, to avoid that is the most important thing. So that worries the most. And I think that's what countries are working on exactly right now on many different levels and many different sectors.
I guess there's also, if I could just add to this, I mean, you know, if economics and business can be stabilizing, right? So if we have in Northeast Asia, you know, or at least until very recently, had a perfectly functioning triangle trade where there are mutual dependencies, and Japan needed South Korea, and South Korea needed China, and China needed Japan, and vice versa, and that was actually very stabilizing, you know. And with all the talk and the history, and we don't like each other, but let's do business, and that's actually very, very good, right? And so I would be worried that if we decouple the business, that we take away one of the pillars of the stabilizer, the balancing pillars, right? And then we're on a wobbly chair, so that's the concern. Okay, so then the positive question. Okay, so why do you think that that's actually not going to happen? Give us a sort of the business or, you know, global policy view of why you're not all in tears or depressed. You look cheerful enough. So what's keeping you happy?
I mean, you know, again, that I am worried about it. So I'm not saying it's 0% as much as I'm smiling. I think there is a risk of going too far. But if you look at each take statement or recent statements in APEC or any agreement, we always recognize that. And I mean, no country does not understand the importance of this, for example, trade flow going on, the securing economic efficiency. But I mean, again, I don't want to end with a pessimistic note, but that's, you know, being questioned, especially from the United States, and that's worrying. But if you look at each initiative, that's if I'm gonna talk about what makes me smile, I think that will be it.
Do you think Japan has enough weight to balance this? I mean, the United States becoming unreliable, right? It's still a great country, and it's wonderful and all of that, but we don't know. And and that's of course why there's a lot of, forced, I guess, partially, but also happily adopted, pressure to make Japan a bigger weight in trade negotiations and the multilateral, minilateral, bilateral trade agreements and so forth. Does Japan carry enough weight at the end of the day to keep this all going? Can it grow into this role?
I think so. And as you just mentioned, CPTPP was the great example. And yes, and I think 2 weeks ago, Mireya, Professor Dr. Solis also was talking about this too. But I think Japan definitely carries the weight, not just in the trade field, but I think economic security. Japan is leading in policy making, and there's a lot of discussion going on. So I do believe that Japan carries enough weight, but also with of course the dialogue, but also the understanding of the region and China too. So that is one of the pillars that backs Japan's weight, is what I think.
That's a super important point. That I've heard this a lot recently. That Americans always think, oh, Japan's kind of, so they do business in a different way, and it's all different. And the people that I meet that work for Japanese companies say, yeah, that's true. When we come to the United States, we're not really at ease, but when we do business in Asia, we don't have this problem, right? And so I think that's a super important point, is that those neighbors are neighbors, right? And they have been for a very long time, and they understand some things that maybe Europeans and Americans don't see in the same way. Well, time is up. I could go on for hours. Mariko, this is fantastic. It was really great to have had you here, and thank you for burning the midnight oil, as they say, literally. And audience, thank you for sticking with us for this entire hour. And make sure that you've marked your calendar. We'll meet again in 2 weeks to discuss the making of the Shinkansen. So with that, thank you very much. And everybody stay well and healthy. And until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.